The First Century of Conservation at Great Mountain Forest. This is Paul Barton, Professor of Forest Resources at the University of Massachusetts and Executive Director of Great Mountain Forest. Let's begin by considering the character and condition of the forests of what is now southern New England at the time of European settlement. As shown in this diorama in the Fisher Museum at the Harvard Forest, most forests had a wide range of ages and a wide variety of species. Trees like American chestnut and American elm were common. With the exception of areas that were repeatedly burned by Native Americans, there were substantial accumulations of humus, dead branches, and logs of all sizes on the forest floor. The point of this map, published in 1925 by William Greeley, a geographer at Clark University, was that trees grew wherever annual precipitation exceeded annual evaporation. The backbreaking work of clearing the forest for pasture and cropland happened wherever homesteads were established, typically at a rate of 2 to 3 acres per year. The first large-scale logging operations for the sole purpose of timber production began in Maine in the 1700s. This quaint scene was repeated over thousands of acres every winter until, by the early 1800s, Bangor, Maine was the white pine capital of the world, with more than 400 sawmills in operation. As old-growth forests were depleted, the logging camps began their westward trek. These camps were well-organized, well-supplied groups of 100 to 200 men, paid on the basis of how much wood they cut. Some of these men were third or fourth generation loggers from old Maine stock. Others were immigrants who were willing to do any kind of work and were hired a few minutes after they cleared immigration in Boston or New York. There were hundreds, sometimes more than 1,000 of these crews at work every winter throughout the 1800s into the early 1900s. Not every sled load was this large, but they routinely exceeded the weight of a contemporary tractor-trailer. Teamsters guided well-trained horses over carefully prepared ice roads to nearby creeks, rivers, and lakes. Enormous volumes of timber were floated downriver during snowmelt and spring breakup. Log jams, like this spectacular mess, were commonplace occurrences. One of these rivermen may find the key log and start the mad dash to the riverbank in safety. If not, a charge of black powder or dynamite will be used to break the jam. This was happening on every major river in the region. The combined effect of the exponential growth of the U.S. population, an increasingly efficient logging industry, and the seemingly inexhaustible demand for lumber, railroad ties, furniture, and wood products of all shapes and sizes is clearly evident in this 1850 map. It also includes the clearing of land for agriculture. Note that Connecticut's original forest was nearly gone. As loggers and timber barons finally arrived in the Pacific Northwest, they could scarcely believe the size and quality of the timber. These trees were so large that even 20 oxen could not move a 32-foot log. But Mr. Dolbear's steam engine and braided steel cable, then called wire rope, could move almost any log in almost any terrain. Specialized gear-driven locomotives that could climb steep grades and haul enormous loads replaced draft animals and river drives. It seemed that nothing could escape the axe and the crosscut saw. By 1920, the inevitable end was near. Nothing is inexhaustible. Cut out and get out was the business plan, and barren landscapes were the price of progress. As Stuart Holbrook wrote in 1938, Bangor, Maine set the classic pattern that would follow the timber line west to the Pacific shore, distant by 3,000 miles, 100 years, and 2 trillion board feet of lumber. In 1915, William Bullock, an English timber buyer, wrote, "The treatment of the forest wealth of the United States is one long example of prodigal waste." He went on to praise the reforestation and forest management work in Europe, India, and Japan in the same book. The cutover, as it was called, was a ubiquitous sight across much of the northern United States. Loggers would ruefully joke that they gave an area a close shave. On the Canaan Mountain Plateau and what is now the Great Mountain Forest, shown approximately by the green shading, a different set of economic forces were driving the changes in the land. They emanated from the small village and industrial complex outlined in yellow on this circa 1880 map. For almost 200 years, the iron industry in the Berkshires and the Litchfield Hills generated a steady and sizable demand for wood. Throughout the 1800s, there were 7 or 8 blast furnaces in operation. The blast furnace is surrounded by a 5-story building on the left side of this photo from the Trinity Church Archives in Lime Rock. These were large-scale industrial operations that produced everything from cannons to railroad car wheels. Before anthracite coal and coke replaced charcoal as the primary fuel for iron and steel production, about 16 square miles or 10,000 acres per year were clear-cut or stripped in local parlance to fuel the furnaces. Doctoral dissertation research by Herbert Weiner in the 1950s carefully quantified the extent of cutting on what is now the Great Mountain Forest. Over the course of a century, almost every usable tree was cut, and most stands were cut again as soon as the trees reached a reasonable size. In total, at least 300,000 cords were cut on 6,000 acres, about 10 square miles. So what does 300,000 cords look like? Well, the 2 red maple trees that I cut, split, and stacked on a Saturday afternoon isn't much help. How about this impressive stack cut by the GMF crew a few years ago? Just think of 3,700 more. Perhaps this will help. This is 1 million cubic meters of spruce and pine logs that were salvaged from 50 square miles of industrial plantations in southern Sweden after they were flattened by a major windstorm. 1 million cubic meters comes out to 276,000 cords. Recall that for Great Mountain Forest, it was at least 300,000 cords from only 10 square miles in the course of 100 years. Among other things, it shows the remarkable resilience and productive capacity of the forests of southern New England. It took almost a century for weary communities surrounded by cut-over forest, for scholars like George Perkins Marsh and Franklin Hugh, and naturalists like John Burroughs and John Muir, joined by foresters like Gifford Pinchot and Henry Graves, and at long last, bold political leaders like Theodore Roosevelt, to bring our nation to its senses. Conservation was not an option, it was an imperative. Theodore Roosevelt did not mince words about practices like this, cutting trees that were so large they had to be sectioned into 2-foot shingle bolts. In 1900, as governor of New York, he said, "I recognize the right of this generation to develop and use our natural resources, but I do not recognize the right to waste them or to rob by wasteful use the generations that come after us. In 1885, the Catskill and Adirondack Forest Preserves were established. In 1891, the Congress passed the Forest Reserves Act, followed in 1897 by the Organic Act, which authorized the establishment of national forests in the West. In 1900, the Pinchot family endowed the Yale Forest School, and Henry Graves became its first dean. In 1905, the U.S. Forest Service was established in the Department of Agriculture with Gifford Pinchot at its head. These initiatives, laws, and policies were all fine and well, but individual action and leadership was needed to complete the transformation. Starling Childs and Frederick Walcott, friends since their time at Groton and Yale, purchased 3,000 acres of cut-over charcoal land and established the Childs Walcott Game Preserve, a clear affirmation of progressive-era conservation. Of course, it also served as a wonderful country retreat for their families. As Aldo Leopold said in 1935, relegating conservation to the government is like relegating virtue to the Sabbath. It turns over to professionals what should be the daily work of amateurs. This was the ecological and philosophical landscape that helped to form the character of Edward C. Ted Childs. Ted graduated from the Yale Forest School in 1932. He added more than 3,000 acres to the Great Mountain Forest and built the Yale Forestry Camp in 1941. He hired foresters and a forest crew to help him realize his ambitious vision for this land. And he established a summer internship that has influenced generations of forestry and environmental science students. He had the great good sense to marry Elizabeth Calder with this happy result. He fostered and encouraged strong ties to the forest by his many Childs and Lawrence relatives. He established a not-for-profit trust in 1962 with a charter that is remarkable in its scope and clarity. And finally, he inspired Elizabeth to place a conservation easement on the Great Mountain Forest in 2003. Here's how my distinguished colleague, Jim Nelson, the retired state forester of Pennsylvania, describes the general changes in the environmental consciousness of foresters over the course of the 20th century. Motivated by Pinchot, Graves, Zahn, and other leaders, the land ethic of foresters grew exponentially between 1900 and the late 1930s. When the U.S. was swept into World War II, the battle cry in the forest was, "Get the wood out." By inference, they would clean up the mess later. Later was delayed by the post-war building boom, government policies, and the allure of large profits. In 1944, and again in 1960, the Congress reminded the U.S. Forest Service of its reason for being: the conservation and stewardship of forest for multiple benefits and values, and to avert the repetition of the 19th century timber famine. Most foresters readily changed their ways. A recalcitrant minority stayed on that low road as logging superintendents, not foresters per se. In the 1980s, the limitations of the multiple-use sustained yield paradigm, trying to do all things and be all things to all people on every acre, was recast into a more pragmatic and scientifically sound ecosystem management approach. In relation to the Great Mountain Forest, it's important to note that Ted Childs entered the profession here, and also that the net result of recent innovations in forest management was really to get us back to where he already was in the 1930s. The sterling faculty of the Yale Forest School in the 1930s helped to form Ted Childs as a forester, conservationist, and philanthropist. With Henry Graves as dean and the authors of every major textbook in the field as your mentors, Professors Chapman, Garrett, Hawley, and Lutz, attending the Yale Forest School was analogous to preparing for the ministry at a seminary where St. Peter was the rector and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the principal lecturers. Ted's early work in establishing evergreen plantations on open land bears the stamp of this training and the strong European influence on American forestry at the time. Ted and the forest crew reestablished other traditional uses and kept meticulous records of weather, sap yield, and timing. In short, all the monitoring that is discussed and rarely sustained in present-day ecosystem management plans has been going on at GMF since the 1930s. Ted Childs and Senator Walcott saw education as an integral part of forest conservation and stewardship. After Yale's field camp in Easton, Connecticut, was heavily damaged in the 1938 hurricane, they built the Yale Forestry Camp at Great Mountain and donated it to the school. "1950 also marked the arrival of Darrell Russ, Ted's friend and colleague for almost 50 years. Ted invited Darrell to come to GMF for 2 weeks as a consultant right after he completed his master's thesis on red pine plantations at Penn State. He stayed for the rest of his life. Darrell was born and raised in Hibbing, Minnesota, way up north on the Iron Range. He often joked that he came to Norfolk for the nice warm winters. Darrell weathered the Great Depression, served in the Pacific in World War II, obtained an excellent forestry education, and retained the optimistic can-do attitude of many in the greatest generation. He was a perfect fit for Great Mountain Forest. In a rare lapse in record keeping, the exact name of the horse has been lost to history. We do know, however, that it is either Chub 1 or Chub 2. Chub 2 appears to be waiting for a chance to bite the photographer. Darrell and Ted were dedicated and effective mentors for scores of summer interns. This is a photo of one of their regional field tours that Ted and Darrell organized to supplement the learning experience at Great Mountain Forest. Ted established a weather station in 1931 as part of his master's thesis work at Yale. Darrell quickly became a partner in this enterprise. They won every service award the National Weather Service has to offer on their way to building an invaluable climate record. Norfolk 2 Southwest is one of 15 stations in a national network of 15,000 that merits the designation of Reference Climatological Station. We are the direct beneficiaries of a management philosophy and absolute dedication to forest conservation that marked the partnership of Ted Childs and Darrell Russ for almost half of GMF's first century. The net results of their work can be seen in our crystal clear streams, protected by 6,000 acres of diverse and healthy trees. Sometimes the results of their work may escape our notice, like this wild turkey hen crouched on her nest. She's a descendant of the birds that were transferred from Pennsylvania to Great Mountain Forest in 1975. This keystone species, an all-American bird, was eliminated from our region by overhunting and habitat loss. It's thriving today. It has been a privilege to host the Cristodora program for nearly 20 years. These young people are gifted environmental science students from New York City who spend about 2 weeks in July at the Yale Forestry Camp. The experiential learning emphasis of the program is clear and very effective. In recent years, many of the New York City high school teachers who lead the group are also dedicated alumni of the program. I'd like to conclude this presentation with a brief example of a new learning opportunity for Christodora and all the other friends of Great Mountain Forest that in many important ways illustrates our unique brand of sustainable forest management, research, and education. Last fall, Steve DiStefano and Ed Faison approached us about including GMF in a regional network of experimental sites in southern New England to study moose and forest change. Yes, there are already a few moose on the Great Mountain Forest. We eagerly agreed to their proposal. The initial work on this project was done on the Quabbin Forest in central Massachusetts, the source of drinking water for 2.2 million people in metropolitan Boston and 40 surrounding communities. There were about 5 moose on this 55,000-acre forest 10 years ago. Now there are at least 100. This is a view of the Prescott Peninsula from the Enfield Lookout. That's Mount Monadnock in southern New Hampshire on the horizon, the faint blue peak on the right side of the photograph. Here's another view of the primary research area on a satellite image. Like many wildlife ecology studies, some animals are fitted with telemetry collars. This is the same bull moose at different times of the year. Note the differences in his coat, weight, and antler development. These collars also contain a GPS receiver and a data logger that records the location of the animal every 2 hours, in this case from the summer of 2007 through the summer of 2008, for a bull moose on the Prescott Peninsula. This data series shows researchers and forest managers what part of the forest the animals use by hour, by day, and by season. This fenced area, an exclosure in wildlife research jargon, prevents the moose and other animals from browsing the tree seedlings and other plants in a recently harvested area. It's the control or reference condition for the field experiment. Other exclosures are built to permit deer and rabbits to enter while still excluding the moose, to allow researchers to quantify the proportional effect of each species. The network of sites in Massachusetts and Connecticut will help to describe landscape scale patterns, processes, and movements. This is a 5-year-old exclosure on the Allegheny Plateau in western Pennsylvania. It clearly shows the effects of overbrowsing by deer on the right-hand side of the photograph. That's Jim Nelson wearing the tan vest on the left-hand side of that group of worried foresters. Smile! You're on motion-activated candid wildlife camera. It's 1:15 a.m. and this midnight snack will continue until well past dawn. An adult moose consumes about 40 pounds of browse per day, 5 or 10 times more than an adult deer. This elegant little doe is posing inside of one of the partial exclosures. To initiate the study at GMF, a 4-acre patch cut was needed. This opening will quickly green up with young trees from seeds and root sprouts. The opening was cut in an oak and pine stand that had already been thinned twice over the last 30 years. In addition, 2009 was an exceptional seed year for white pine. Finally, the site is adjacent to a wetland and pond. In short, it's perfect moose habitat. So under Jody Bronson's watchful eye, the summer interns, Charles Gill on the left and my son Mike on the right, are learning by doing. Charles is enrolled in a forestry, sustainable agriculture, and outdoor education program at Sterling College in Vermont. Mike is studying environmental science and geography at Lakehead University in Western Ontario. Jody was a summer intern more than 30 years ago while earning forestry degrees in Maine and New Hampshire. He succeeded Darrell Russ as forest manager after working as his assistant for many years. Darrell's son Russell is now the assistant forester. By the way, there were moose and deer tracks in this opening less than 24 hours after the last few logs were removed. They are well aware of the activity and come to browse the buds and new shoots that are now on the forest floor. It turns out the chainsaw is the dinner bell. Like generations of summer interns that came before them, for Charles and Mike, this is the forestry equivalent of working your way up from the mailroom. The pine logs from the wildlife patch cut went to South Norfolk Lumber to be sawn into boards and beams. The oak logs were sold to Berkshire Hardwoods. This paid for all the trucking and the sawing, and generated a small surplus that went right back into our general operating fund. Some of the lumber will be used to repair a cabin on the forest. Mr. Bronson, like Darrell Russ before him, usually changes the summer intern's sleeve length by an inch or two. They don't need a gym membership and can eat as much as they want. They're stacking the green lumber so it will air dry without warping or twisting. Most of the wood from the wildlife patch will be used to build a new sugar house, based on a design from the first sugar house built by Ted Childs and the forest crew in 1941. So there you have it, the deliberate and creative integration of management, education, and research. It's our heritage and our future. Oh, by the way, that bench you're sitting on, you guessed it, it was made in our shop. The legs are made from the different species of birch that grow on the Great Mountain Forest. The heavy planks came from this large red spruce tree that was salvaged after it was struck by lightning. The light-colored ribs in this beautiful and functional Adirondack guide boat built by Pete Anderson also came from that spruce tree. I can't think of a better way to sequester carbon and mitigate global climate change. A century ago, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and they, Starling Childs and Frederick Walcott, and Ted and Elizabeth Childs, they took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. The Board of Trustees and staff will be staying on that road less traveled. It's a road that will honor their legacy and our obligations to posterity as we begin a new century of conservation and stewardship at the Great Mountain Forest. We are very grateful to Barry Weber and Ann Havemeyer of the Norfolk Historical Museum for all their work on this exhibit. Thank you all for coming. We hope you enjoy the exhibit, and we hope to see you at Great Mountain Forest events in years to come.